Can you believe that in 1945, the United States held over 4,000 German prisoners of war on its own soil, and among them were 800 men sent to Kentucky expecting revenge and punishment. But when the train doors opened, it wasn't guns waiting for them, it was Fieldson. If you were the enemy and the first person you met didn't raise a fist but handed you a shovel, would it change what you believed? Subscribe to our channel and see how it really happened. A long line of olive-drab boxcars rattling across the hills of Kentucky in the spring of 1945. Inside, 800 German prisoners of war pressed their faces to the slit, looking out at a country they had bombed in propaganda posters but never expected to see with their own eyes. Many of them thought this was punishment, humiliation, the final act of a lost war. They had marched through the ruins of France, crawled out of foxholes in Italy, or been dragged from hedgerows in Normandy. They had heard stories that Americans would beat them, starve them, make them work like slaves. So when the train slowed near a small town, and they saw handwritten signs, fresh eggs, tobacco for sale, church social Saturday, they braced for hatred. Instead, something else happened. WWII. To understand why 800 German POWs in Kentucky walked away, changed men, you have to step back to the bigger picture. By 1945, the United States was holding more than 4,000 German prisoners of war on its own soil. They were scattered across hundreds of camps from Texas cotton fields to the pine forests of Minnesota. The Geneva Convention allowed the Allies to use POW labor as long as the men were paid and treated humanely. America had something else, a labor crisis, with millions of U.S. soldiers overseas. Farms back home were desperate for hands. In states like Kentucky, famous for its tobacco, corn, and hemp, the math was simple. Without new workers, crops would rot in the fields. So the War Department did something unthinkable to many Americans. It sent captured enemy soldiers to live and work in the middle of small-town America. One of those places was Kentucky. When the doors of the boxcars finally slid open, heat and the smell of damp earth hit the Germans first. They climbed down under the watchful eyes of a few American MPs, their rifles slung low, not leveled. The Germans stood in formation, about 800 men, many in faded field gray uniforms with insignia, hastily ripped off, some wearing bits of captured American clothing. They were marched to the trucks that would take them to a newly established branch camp, a hastily fenced compound of tar paper barracks on the edge of farmland. To the prisoners, it looked like what they expected: barbed wire guard towers, strict roll calls. But then the first surprise came. They were issued work clothes, sturdy denim, not rags. At mess they received meat, potatoes, bread, and even coffee. The food was better than many had eaten in the Wehrmacht during the last months of the war. And on the wall of the mess hall, translated into German, was a notice for each day of work they would be paid in canteen coupons. They could buy cigarettes, candy, soap. They could order English books or even German novels through the Red Cross. This was not the humiliation they expected. Every morning, the 800 men were divided into smaller work details, 40 here, 60 there, depending on the farms that needed them. They climbed onto the backs of trucks and rumbled down dusty roads past wooden houses with front porches and children playing in yards. Some locals stared, some turned away, but others waved, crumbled adieu for they will plant a bistrut. The first time a German POW working a Kentucky tobacco field was handed an ice-cold drink by a farmer's wife, he didn't know what to do. He had been told that Americans were brutal, decadent, godless, yet the woman simply said, "You look hot here," and smiled awkwardly. Stories like that spread quickly inside the camp. Kranz up tank. One day, a group of about 40 prisoners was sent to a large farm south of town. The farmer was behind on his planting and his sons were overseas with the Third Army. He watched the Germans line up in his field expecting resentment, maybe sabotage. Instead, he saw something familiar: disciplined men forming rows, working in step, plowing and planting with the same precision they might have once used to dig trenches. These were soldiers, but they were also farm boys from Bavaria, from the Rhineland, from small villages along the Elbe. They knew the feel of earth in their hands. The farmer spoke no German. The prisoners spoke almost no English. So they started with gestures: point here, plant there. Over time, a shared language developed: tools, hand signs, a few learned words. Good, enough, faster, rest. In the evenings back in camp, the Germans talked. They spoke of the strange kindness of the Americans, of the teenage girl at a country store who had shyly said Guten Tag, and then giggled, of the way farmers looked them in the eye, not as animals, not as Huns, but as men who could be trusted with tools, with wagons, sometimes even with working away from direct supervision for a few hours. It began to crack something inside them. Many of these POWs had grown up under Hitler. From the Hitler Youth onward, they had been told that foreign democracies were weak, decadent, cruel hypocrites. Yet here in the middle of Kentucky, they worked fields that stretched to the horizon, in a land that seemed both rich and strangely relaxed. One prisoner later wrote that he had expected skyscrapers and gangsters, the America of Nazi propaganda. Instead, he found porch swings, church bells, and neighbors who talked over fences. There were tensions. Some towns people resented having enemy soldiers nearby. There were strict rules: no fraternization, no entering private homes, no gifts exchanged. MPs reminded farmers constantly, yet small gestures slipped through the cracks. An extra biscuit at lunch, a handshake at the end of harvest, a Bible in German left by accident in the back of a truck for Lotzi. The U.S. Army, too, had its own plan to turn these POW camps into classrooms. By mid-1945, the war in Europe was almost over. The Americans knew that one day these men would be going back to a shattered Germany. So in Kentucky, as in many other states, they began offering what they called re-education. Lectures on democracy films showing Nazi crimes, newspapers in German that told a very different story from Goebbels' Fravatang. Some hardline Nazis in the camp mocked it. They held whispered meetings, drew swastikas in hidden corners, tried to enforce discipline among the men, but they were losing their grip. Every day in the fields, the prisoners were seeing something that no amount of propaganda could easily erase. Ordinary Americans living ordinary lives in a system that clearly worked. The next day they still went to the fields, only now they were no longer soldiers of the Third Reich in temporary captivity. They were defeated men working in the fields of their conqueror, trying to imagine a future. And yet that future seemed less terrifying in Kentucky than they had once thought. As months went by, more than one local farmer quietly said to an MP, "If he doesn't want to go back, I'd hire him." Some POWs asked if there was any way to stay officially. There wasn't. International law demanded repatriation, but the U.S. Army took note of something important. Men who had worked alongside Americans in places like Kentucky were less likely to return home bitter, more likely to question the ideology that had led them to war. When the order finally came to send them back, the 800 men who had seen Kentucky lined up again at the train station. This time they looked out at a landscape that had become familiar, at church steeples, barns, and the rolling green fields they had helped plant and harvest. Some of the farmers who had hired them stood at a distance. They weren't supposed to say goodbye, but a few lifted their hands anyway. One POW later remembered an old Kentuckian quietly saying in broken German, "Good luck, boy." The Germans climbed aboard. The doors slid shut. They had arrived expecting humiliation and cruelty. They left with something far more dangerous to Nazism than punishment: first-hand knowledge that the world their leaders had described was a lie. Years later, some of those men would tell their children about the war, about battles and hunger, and about a strange season when enemy uniforms worked Kentucky soil and discovered that the people they had been taught to hate treated them day by day simply as men. The end. Subscribe to the channel, and don't miss new war documentaries.